Hello, it's Steve Van Tassel here for Dynasty Owner. How is everybody doing today? I want to welcome you to our Dynasty Owner Playoff Awards for 2020. I know what you're asking yourself. Why do we need more awards? Well, the reason why we're having playoff awards is to give a glimpse, to look back at the 2020 playoffs for Dynasty Owner, and to give you a glimpse into how those performances, the best performances of the playoffs, are going to impact those players in 2021 startup drafts. Because right now, what I'm all about is helping you with your startup draft, whether you're a new Dynasty owner who's just coming onto the platform for 2021 and doesn't really know a lot about how it works, or whether you're an experienced Dynasty owner who played last year and now wants to add another team to your portfolio. So what we're going to do is we're going to have some playoff awards. What we're going to do is we're going to have a playoff player of the year. We're going to have a runner-up for the playoff player of the year, and then we're going to have a breakout player of the year. Conveniently, all of them are quarterbacks. So when we go to position by position and name our position players, playoff player of the year, runner-up, and breakout, those will all be the same. What happened in 2019 was that we had some players who broke out that year, such as Kenyon Drake, and really made a name for themselves in the 2019 playoffs. And then we're improved their draft stock for 2020, even though Kenyon Drake's salary went from under $1 million to over $8 million, almost $8.5 million in 2020. So without further ado, let's name some playoff players of the year. And first, we're going to name the playoff player of the year, and it's Josh Allen from the Buffalo Bills, quarterback of the Buffalo Bills. Allen had the most Dynasty Owner fantasy points in the playoffs. He had 112.4. And so that got him the playoff player of the year. The runner-up was also a quarterback. It was Lamar Jackson of the Baltimore Ravens, who had 104.2 Dynasty Owner fantasy points. And our breakout player of the year is Jalen Hurts of the Philadelphia Eagles, who had 90 Dynasty Owner fantasy points in the playoffs. So congratulations to all three of them. Though they are also, we also are going to have position players and runner-up and breakouts of the year. And since all those guys are quarterbacks, as we know, those are our quarterbacks of the year. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on each player a little bit now. So Josh Allen was the playoff player of the year, and while he can't go, while you would think his ADP last year was 24.7, and you wonder, can he go even higher this year? And the answer is yes. Actually, he's got a $5.3 million salary. He's working on his rookie contract, and he was drafted at the end of the second round, beginning of the third round, generally last year. And I think for 2021, he's probably going to be a first-round draft pick, maybe even an early first-round draft pick after his performance in 2020 in the regular season and the playoffs. Next, we have Lamar Jackson, and a lot of you drafted Lamar Jackson in 2020, number 1, number 2, number 3, with you in your Dynasty Owner startup, and maybe that didn't pay off in the regular season, but hopefully it did a little bit in the playoffs for you. And while he's probably not going to go as high as he did last year, he's still operating under his rookie contract, which is a little over $2.3 million. And so, regardless of how you feel about his performance in the regular season, he did shine in the playoffs, and he does have a chance to probably not match his ADP from last year, but at least be close to it. I think he's still probably a first or second round pick. And then on the breakout player, we have Jalen Hurts of the Philadelphia Eagles, who didn't even start till week 13 of the regular season, but then started all 3 playoff games and averaged 30 Dynasty Owner fantasy points per game in the playoffs. His ADP was 158.8 in 2020, which made him drafted around generally in the 13th round. And that's because people weren't sure whether he was going to be able to overtake Carson Wentz last year. And so they drafted him in his $1.5 million salary without knowing that. I think next year, depending on who the Eagles hire as a coach, we should have a better idea in the offseason what happens. And by the time you're drafting, you'll know whether Hurts is probably going to be the starter or the backup. But either way, even if he is the backup, I think his ADP is going to be better than 158.8 in 2021. So you're going to have to grab him earlier than you. If you played this year, you're going to have in 2020. You're going to have to grab him earlier in 2021. So now we move on to running backs, and our running back playoff player of the year is Alvin Kamara. And what can you say about Alvin Kamara? ADP 7.7, less than $1 million. He was the runner-up as our running back of the year, but he had the most points for a running back in the playoffs, 99. So as I mentioned, his ADP of 7.7 is probably not going to go higher, especially since his salary is increasing from just under $1 million to $15 million in 2021. However, I still expect him to be a pretty high pick. The runner-up for playoff running back of the year is Derrick Henry of the Tennessee Titans, who really earned most of this honor from his first game in the fantasy playoffs, when he had 42.2 dynasty owner fantasy points. Overall, Henry was a pretty high draft pick. I expect his salary was $10.3 million last year, and it's got to jump up slightly to $12.5 million next year. So even though he had an ADP of 29.3 in 2020, I expect him to be drafted around the same area, maybe a slight drop because of the extra $2.2 million and another year of wear and tear on his body. But the breakout running back of the playoffs was somebody who was drafted pretty high in Dynasty Owner because of his $1 million salary, but whose ADP will go up next year. Definitely. I feel definitely that his ADP will go up next year after his performance at the end of the regular season, as well as the playoffs. And that player is David Montgomery of the Chicago Bears. His ADP in 2020 was 44.2. And that's mainly because of his salary, which is just a tick over $1 million a year. So he had two consecutive weeks at the end of the regular season of more than 27 dynasty owner fantasy points, and he finished that up with averaging 25.9 dynasty owner fantasy points in the 3-game playoffs. So I think his performance over the last 5 games of the year is going to give him is going to make him be drafted even higher in 2021 than he was in 2020. Now we move on to our wide receivers, and the playoff wide receiver of the year was Stefon Diggs, who had 96.3 dynasty owner fantasy points in the playoffs. So if you were in dynasty owner playing dynasty owner in 2020 and you had a Josh Allen, Stefon Diggs stack going for you, you are probably sitting here watching this video and looking at your dynasty dollars and seeing how much of that has increased over the course of the year, because you probably did pretty well in your league. So Diggs is an interesting case, as he's one of the few playoff position players of the year whose ADP is probably going to go up, since last year he was drafted at 102.5 on average. And while his salary he was switching teams from Minnesota to Buffalo, and his salary was $14.4 million a year. So I think people were a little worried about that with the switch and the lack of offseason workouts. But he clicked right away with Josh Allen, continued all season, and did so in the playoffs. And now, because his salary of $14.4 million is probably not going up for 2021, I see him being drafted even higher, especially based on his playoff performance. The runner-up for wide receiver of the playoffs is Davante Adams of the Green Bay Packers. And what can you say about Davante Adams? I mean, him and Aaron Rodgers click. He's $14.5 million in salary. He was one of the best players when he played all year. He's the second best wide receiver in the playoffs. And he had an ADP of 29.0 for the 2020 season, which I expect to probably be right around the same amount in 2021. Maybe a little bit higher, maybe a little bit higher, because other wide receivers continue to get more salary than him, continue to get paid higher salary than him, but we'll see. So our breakout wide receiver of the year, someone who is on a one-year contract, one for the veteran minimum, it's Nelson Agholor of the Las Vegas Raiders. He played this year for a little over $1 million, $1,047,500. And his salary for 2021 is kind of unknown. And this is a little bit like the Brashad Perryman from 2019, who performed well in the playoffs on a low salary, got a significant increase, switched teams. We don't know if Agholor is going to switch teams or not, and then really didn't live up to expectations in 2020 that he had the flash that he had produced in 2019. So not sure about Agholor. I do know that he was the 7th best wide receiver in the playoffs, and he was behind some big names. You got Stephon Diggs, you got Davante Adams, you've got Calvin Ridley, Mike Evans, DeAndre Hopkins, and Allen Robinson. And Agholor was outscored by all of them, but he did outscore our number one wide receiver from the regular season, Tyreek Hill, in the playoffs. So that's a pretty impressive performance by Agholor. So now we're going to move on to tight ends. And believe it or not, our playoff tight end player of the year is, drumroll please, Travis Kelce. Travis Kelce is the number one wide receiver, number one tight end, regardless of regular season, playoffs, 2019, 2020. It's Travis Kelce. And last year, you were able to draft him in about the third round on average. Him and his $9.37 million salary, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens this year because his salary is going up to $14.3 million a year. He still won't be the highest paid tight end, but his salary is going up. But you've got to balance that off with that production that he gives you. And so I expect Kelce to probably be one of the highest tight ends drafted again this year in Dynasty. He was third. His ADP was third last year, and he could jump up to first or second, depending on what people feel about some of the other tight ends. And speaking of other tight ends, the runner-up for the playoff tight end of the year is Darren Waller. Just like in the regular season, Darren Waller excelled in the fantasy playoffs, but not enough to be ahead of Travis Kelce. But the good side of Waller for 2020 and for 2021 is that he costs less. He's actually $7.45 million per season, which sounds like a lot, but it's actually only for 2021 right now. He's only the 8th. He's going to be the 8th highest paid tight end in Dynasty Owner. And so I expect that he's probably going to move up. His ADP last year was 77.3, and I expect that that's going to move up considerably in 2021 based on his performance in the 2020 playoffs. And finally, our breakout tight end of the year is Irv Smith of the Minnesota Vikings. Now, Smith is an interesting case because his ADP last year was 132.9 because of his potential in his $1.45 million contract. And those Dynasty owners who took him in 2020 were regretting that decision during the regular season, as he only scored 47.2 Dynasty Owner fantasy points. But he turned it on in the playoffs. He scored 46.3, almost as many in 3 games as he had during the regular season. And he really set himself up for possibly have a bigger role in the Minnesota offense next year and possibly be drafted around the same area or maybe even higher, depending on your appetite for his production at the end of 2020 in terms of projecting that for 2021. He'll be an interesting case to see as his $1.45 million salary is intact for 2021. So we'll have to see if people are going to rely on what he did in the regular season when he was definitely not worth that salary in his ADP, or whether they're going to focus more on how he finished the season in the playoffs when he was definitely worth it. So that's it. Those are all the awards. Congratulations to all the winners. To summarize a couple of things. What have we learned from the playoffs, the 2020 playoffs, that's going to help us in our 2021 startup drafts? First thing is that the quarterbacks who excelled in 2020 in the playoffs, your Josh Allens, your Lamar Jacksons, your Jalen Hurts, all those guys are on rookie contracts. So they're all cheap. They're not going to cost you $45 million like Patrick Mahomes. They're not going to cost you $39 million like Deshaun Watson. They're going to cost you $5.3 million for Josh Allen, a little under $2.4 million for Lamar Jackson, and $1.5 million for Jalen Hurts. So they're going to be among the top draft picks in 2021. Second category is sort of players who did better in the playoffs than they did in the regular season and are still playing under that rookie contract. There's a couple of those. That's David Montgomery and Irv Smith. So both of them should see a bump in their ADP as well. Definitely for Montgomery, even though he was drafted higher at 44.2 last year, I expect him to be higher. Smith, we'll see. It depends. Because he wasn't as productive in the regular season as Montgomery was. And finally, we're going to see a bump in a couple of veterans who really did well in the regular season and the playoffs, Stephon Diggs and Darren Waller, who were drafted fairly high, but are really going to be should be drafted much higher in 2021 based on their performance in 2020. So thank you for watching. Please like the video. Please read the article, the full article, to get even more information. It includes kickers if you want to see who the playoff kicker of the year and runner-up were. So please like the video. Please follow me on Twitter. You can see my handle down there. It's SteveVT33. And also, keep an eye out for the videos and the articles from the rest of our Dynasty Owner team. We've got Nate Christian, who's going to break down rookies in his prospect preview. We've got Matt the Jerk, who is back for another year and is doing his deep dive into contracts, which those videos and articles show up on Wednesday. And then for those of you who have a rebuild, didn't do so well in Dynasty Owner in 2020, but want to do better in 2021, Jay Pounds is going to take you through how to rebuild your Dynasty Owner roster on Thursday. So please read all of the articles, watch all the videos, like all the videos, and follow the three of us, as well as Dynasty Owner on Twitter. Thanks a lot. Have a great day, and I will see you next week. Bye.